And I thought maybe I would get started by playing just a very short clip because even though Marcus Garvey was really known for his oratory, there aren't any recordings of him that are still left. There's only two very short audio clips, and I wanted to play one of those so you can get a sense of what his voice sounded like. And this is also a kind of a cool clip because he's explaining briefly what the Universal Negro Improvement Association is.
Fellow citizens of Africa, I greet you in the name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. You may ask, what organization is that? It is for me to inform you that the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that seeks to unite into one solid body the 400 million Negroes of the world, to link up the 15 million Negroes of the United States of America with the 20 million Negroes of the West Indies, the 40 million Negroes of South and Central America with the 280 million Negroes of Africa for the purpose of bettering our industrial, commercial, educational, social, and political conditions. As you are aware, the world in which we live today is divided into separate race groups and distinct nationalities. Each race and each nationality is endeavoring to work out its own destiny to the exclusion of other races and other nationalities. We hear the cry of England for the Englishman, of France for the Frenchman, of Germany for the German, of Ireland for the Irish, of Palestine for the Jew, of Japan for the Japanese, of China for the Chinese. We of the Universal Negro Improvement Association are raising the cry of Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is just briefly kind of put all this in context, and I'm work my way down to the UNIA division in Chattanooga. And I'm just calling it Black Community Organizing in Chattanooga in the 1920s. So when you think about Black leadership, most people from this time period, you first of all think of Booker T. Washington, and you think about W.E.B. Du Bois, and usually these people are presented to us when we're getting our education, K through 12 education, but you don't really hear much about Garvey. So this was something that about 25 years ago I became very interested in, and why don't you hear about Marcus Garvey? And then the classic sort of setup for learning about Washington and Du Bois is to say that they were kind of enemies and they were, kind of not working toward the same goal. And that's really not that accurate. They were working for racial advancement, but they had different ideas and strategies for doing it. And the context that we're talking about today is the 1920s and the period just after World War I. And these are the factors, I think, that really propelled the Garvey movement as well as Black organizing in general. And, because during slavery, enslaved people it was illegal to teach them to read. So there was a lot of catching up to do in terms of literacy. And so that was, literacy within the Black community was growing, and really the only people that weren't literate at this point were people who had to work rather than take time out to go to school. There was also some really interesting and good newspapers. The Black press was incredibly important in spreading information and ideas, and most churches and towns and everywhere that had their own Black newspaper, but there were certain ones that were national editions, and you've probably heard of the Chicago Defender, which was really the biggest Black national newspaper during this period. Another one that you might not have heard of is the Negro World newspaper, and this was the Garvey newspaper, and it circulated not just around the United States, but it also circulated in Africa, in the West Indies, and South America, even as far as Australia, and anywhere where Black people were. Another thing that's really big during the 20s is this is a period of the Great Migration. Most black people were living in the South prior to that. But you had about 1/10 of the black population in America is going to shift from the rural ex-Confederate states, the southern states, into northern cities like Philadelphia, New York, and even later on places like Detroit and Chicago and even Los Angeles. Another thing that's happening during this time period is a really substantial black middle class is emerging. And so you're seeing prosperous African Americans who are highly educated, have money, own their homes, own land, own businesses. And so there's kind of a critical mass going on within the black community. But at the same time, this is also the height of the Jim Crow era where segregation was legal and African Americans were in the law legally placed in second-class citizen status. And then also in correlation with the Great Migration and the movement of black people all around, you have a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. So this is a really dynamic and interesting time in African American history. And some of you may be familiar with Jacob Lawrence, the artist, who did a 40-panel series of various things, but he has, it's called the Migration Series, and I just picked out a couple of these. These are people huddling into the train station to go to Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. And then this is another one of my favorites from the Migration Series by Jacob Lawrence. My book, I also have a Jacob Lawrence panel from the Great Migration Series on the cover. So now to talk about Garvey and his place in all of this. This is one of the best, I think, one of the best photo portraits of Marcus Garvey. And he founded this organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He was from Jamaica. So he was, Jamaica was not an independent country at the time. It was part of the British Empire. So he was a subject of the British Empire. And in some ways that gave him protection when he traveled around because he was a British subject. He traveled a lot in the Caribbean and Central America, in Europe. And he sort of saw what was going on with people of African descent all over the world, and he didn't really like what he saw. And so he had sort of a global perspective on what the problems were for people of African descent. He came to the United States and he found this country so ripe that he decided to reestablish his organization here, based in New York City and Harlem, to publish his newspaper, The Negro World, from here, and for that to be the headquarters of the organization, and that's around 1916. Now, just a little bit about the UNIA. Most of this you may already know, and it may be pretty obvious, but it's important to think about how this is different from the way other black people are organizing. And most important kind of thing to know is that this was an organization for people of African descent. If you were not of African descent, you could not be a member of the UNIA. So it was race conscious. It was, from the get-go, it was organizing people into categories based on the idea of that there was a Negro race. If you think in contrast about like the NAACP, their organizing principle was equal citizenship of all Americans. It didn't address the idea of race. It was, assuming that integration was kind of the terminal point. When you look at the numbers of people who were in the UNIA overall, there were divisions, and the name divisions instead of chapters is significant because a division, when you think of a division, that's a military term. Okay, so there's a lot of these kind of references to the military and to army type things. Well, the divisions, local divisions, were anywhere where black people lived. They formed divisions of the UNIA, but a vast majority, 80% of the divisions of the UNIA were in the United States. And some of the goals, the things that you heard in Garvey's speeches and in his rhetoric was his disappointment that African Americans and African people of African descent, didn't love themselves, that they had sort of absorbed all of the negative that had been put upon them over many, many years. And so race pride was really the key, and he did a lot in the Negro World newspaper and also in his speeches, and to always remind people of African heritage that there was a lot to be proud of. He also said, you know, the only way that people who have had power taken away can be powerful is to be organized and to be together. And so this is a really crucial part of the organizing philosophy, is that unity and organization is essential. And you know, there were people of African descent living in places all over the world, and his idea was, if you're of African descent, you should be loyal to your race first, and then, let's say you're an African American, then to the United States second. So your primary loyalty is to your race. And so these are features of what we know as Black nationalism, right? Other features that are found in, like, Booker T. Washington's philosophy and others before him are things like, you know, own your own land, own your own home, own your own business, this idea of economic independence. Don't work for other people, don't rent a home from other people if you can avoid it, and because if you do, you are not economically independent. You don't control your own destiny. And then as an organization, he talked a lot about, it's really social entrepreneurship, which I'll mention it again in a minute. And then of course, separatism for people of African descent to not only not try to, but not even want to be part of white society. The other kind of long-term universal goal of the UNIA was to free Africa from European colonialism. And in the 1920s, there were very few places in Africa. Only Ethiopia was an independent country at that time in Africa. And you're going to see all of that's going to change when you get to 1980. All of Africa is independent. And he called this idea African redemption, redeeming Africa for the African people. And even though Garveyism is portrayed heavily as a Back to Africa movement, this is really not what it was. There were some people that were going to go back to Africa to kind of help free Africa, but it wasn't the idea that every person would go back. So just a word about this idea of social entrepreneurship. When you look at the Black Panthers and you look at even a lot of organizations today, it's very anti-capitalist. It sees how the capitalist system exploits people, and especially people of color. Garvey has been portrayed by some historians as kind of the ultimate capitalist. You know, he wanted to create businesses and he wanted to create a steamship line, but it was never about financial profit. It was never about economic profit. It was about social profit. It was a way for Black people to invest and use their money and give back to the community for the betterment of the community as a whole. So some of the businesses that the UNIA had as you know, part of the organization were, the most famous, of course, was the Black Star Steamship Line, which you could only buy stock in the Black Star Line if you were black. Okay, so that's not how capitalism works, right? The universal factories, like things like clothing factories, factories that made black dolls, millineries that made hats, and then there were, in rural areas, communal farms, restaurants, UNIA laundries, and also social services. Anybody who was a member of the UNIA got $75 when they died for a death fee. This is in Harlem, the Black Star Line headquarters. And so who was attracted to the UNIA and who joined the UNIA? It was what I found especially to be true in the South was it was typically not this emerging black middle class. It was working class people, low income people, people who were poor and exploited by the existing system. The large urban divisions, the places that William was talking about that we kind of all associate with the Garvey movement, like New York City, Chicago, Cleveland, Los Angeles, these were big divisions with tens of thousands of members, but there were also very small divisions in tiny little rural hamlets. And that map that I handed out, you can see each one of those dots represents a place where there was a UNIA division. And if you know anything about the Arkansas, Mississippi Delta right around Memphis there, you know that those areas were very rural agricultural areas, and there were literally dozens of UNIA divisions there. So just a few pictures. I think that photographs help us to kind of transport ourselves back to that time, because sometimes it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of somebody living in the 1920s. So I just have a few photographs of people in Tennessee. This is actually just in the Arkansas Delta, just beyond Memphis. And these are timber workers, and you can't see it, but can you see what she has on her hip there? She's packing heat. She's got a gun. And I like this photograph because it's a family, and the young woman she's armed for self-defense. And this is a big thing. This was a big part of the Garvey movement too, was armed self-defense. The 1920s, the phenomenon of lynching was beginning to taper off, but over the previous 40 to 50 years, over 3,000 people had been lynched in the South. This is a UNIA organizer also in the Memphis area, Britt McKinney. He was a minister, an itinerant minister, and he took the Garvey message around with him to his churches. So this was a very kind of church-based organization in the South as well. That was a really natural place for this kind of political organization to take place. This is a kind of a group picture of the UNIA leadership in Harlem. And you can see, that's Garvey right there, and that's him in his full dress uniform. He was the President General, the Provisional President of Africa. That was his title. And all of these other men who are wearing uniforms are members of the Universal African Legions, which was the military or paramilitary wing of the UNIA. Garvey had a lot of detractors, and this is one of the big reasons why we don't know much about him, is because all these other groups did their best to destroy him, to get him kicked out of the United States, to destroy the movement, and also to destroy his reputation and memory after he was deported and exiled from the United States. So you had the integrationist types, the socialists, some of the biggest journalists. Robert Abbott was the editor of the Chicago Defender. And then, of course, another really huge handicap for Garvey was that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was after him from the very beginning. And ironically, this is where we get a lot of our evidence about the Garvey movement, is from the FBI reports of activities that were going on, what he was doing, what his helpers were doing, what the different divisions in different places were doing. This is also a time, 1919 is known as the time of the first Red Scare. So this is right after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So there's this intense paranoia that Bolshevik or communist ideas are going to creep into this very, very capitalist industrial country. And so, as you probably know, anybody who they couldn't pin something on, they would just accuse them of being a communist. This is a photograph, and I'm sorry that it's not a little brighter, but I wanted you to see the different auxiliaries of the UNIA. This is a UNIA division, and they're holding a portrait of Marcus Garvey, and you notice the women are wearing all white, and these are the Black Cross nurses. Okay, this is named after the Red Cross, right? Kind of a play on words. And nursing, because Black people were not allowed to be treated in white hospitals, nursing was an essential service that the Black Cross nurses of the UNIA could perform. Some of the men you see are wearing the uniforms of the Universal African Legions, so they are soldiers of the UNIA. Okay, so now, Tennessee, coming closer to home. When Garvey came to the United States, he did sort of an exploratory tour, and he only went to two places in the South. Interestingly enough, he went to Nashville and he went to Atlanta. And if he went from Nashville to Atlanta, he had to have come through Chattanooga. I know that much. But he made speeches in both Nashville and Atlanta in 1917. And so this was like the spark that lit the flame. Nashville had the earliest UNIA division in Tennessee, and it was chartered in 1921. But these are the other divisions that we know of that existed in Tennessee. It's not a huge number, but the Chattanooga division alone was so significant that it really deserves a lot of attention. Alcoa, Chattanooga, Franklin, Henry County, Hyde Park, Knoxville. There were two divisions in Knoxville. Memphis, South Nashville, so obviously there were two in Nashville. Newmarket, and Paris. And there was even an appointed state commissioner for the state of Tennessee, and his name was Theophilus Cornelius Glashan, and he was from Sierra Leone. Very interesting guy. I had not done a lot of deep research on him until I was getting ready to come up here, and I think I'm actually going to write an article about him now because he is so interesting. Somebody took this picture, and William sent it to me. This is on 4th Avenue. Did you take this picture?
No, Annie Thomas, one of the co-founders of our organization.
Okay. Yeah, this is where Liberty Hall of Chattanooga, Liberty Hall was the name for the place where the UNIA met. So if you owned your own building for your division, you called it Liberty Hall. So Chattanooga's Liberty Hall was at this spot. It was in the building that had been the Steele's Orphanage. If anybody knows the history, a little more history of Chattanooga than I do. And there were 3 people that I identified as really key players in the Chattanooga division. And forgive me if I don't have this all at my fingertips, but these are the people that I've been kind of reading up on and researching the last few days so that I could give you a little more specific information. We know from the FBI reports a lot about what was going on with the active divisions, but we also know because each division was asked to send a report to Harlem, to the headquarters, and these short reports would get printed in the Negro World newspaper and then distributed out around the world. So people in the organization that read the Negro World really had a good sense of, I'm a part of something very big. I'm part of something that's going on in Cuba and in Panama and in British Guiana and going on in West Africa and South Africa and, you know, all over the world. And so the reports are a very interesting way to kind of read up on what was going on in various places. And you didn't have a report for every division every single week, but you know, if you scan through there, you can kind of follow the trail of whatever division you want to follow and see what was going on and who was involved. And now that we have Ancestry, which I don't know if y'all use that online, but that's a wonderful tool. If you just have a person's name, you can really find out a lot about them through that database. So that's how I found out a lot of things about these three people. Okay, so Miss Minerva Alexander was 16 years old. She lived with her sister, her mother, and her grandmother. And I looked up their address. They lived somewhere in downtown Chattanooga. And neither the grandmother nor the mother were literate. And this is not all that surprising because they had the grandmother was a washerwoman and the mother was, I think she was a domestic. But these were jobs that were very demanding, and maybe they just had not had the opportunity to get a school education. But they were keeping the two girls in school, 16 and 17 years old. They were in the census, they were in school, they could read and write, and obviously the women in their family were making sure that they got the education. Miss Minerva Alexander ended up being the recording secretary for the UNIA division in Chattanooga. So her name appears almost weekly in the Negro World newspaper because she was filing these reports. Emory Bailey was born in Georgia, and I've kind of learned that just in the last few days. A lot of people who live in Chattanooga have moved here from North Georgia, right? It's kind of more a part of Georgia almost than part of Tennessee, it seems like. And the railroad connection to Atlanta really solidifies that too. Well, Emory Bailey was born in Georgia and at some point moved into Chattanooga, and he was working on the Nashville and Chattanooga and St. Louis Railway. And I know there were lots of different railway companies here, so railroad type work was really hard work, and a lot of black men did that type of really heavy labor in the 1920s. Emory Bailey was also the man who was a UNIA member who was in the process of acquiring 200 what were probably World War I vintage, what they called repeating rifles. So he was basically the person who was acquiring arms for the UNIA division and the Universal African Legions in Chattanooga. And then Milton Minyard was a very interesting and enigmatic character. He, in a lot of the records, he claims he was from Ohio, and in some of the records it says he's from Chicago, but he was from Sumter County, Georgia. He was an orphan. He and his three brothers and sisters were orphaned at a very young age. So, you know, I'm making lots of presumptions here, but this is sort of investigative work. My guess is that they were orphaned and they ended up being put together with another family who were farmers, and they were farm people who didn't have education of their own, and they were using and keeping these children, but also requiring them to work for their keep. So these children never got to go to school. I don't think Milton Minyard liked that very much, because by the time he was about 15, he was living in Fitzgerald, Georgia, which happens to be a town where there was a UNIA division when he was there. So I think that's very interesting. I don't have any idea whether he had exposure to the UNIA being in Fitzgerald, Georgia when he was 16, but for whatever reason, in about 1925, he shows up in Chattanooga, and he says, I'm here from Chicago, and I am the president of an organization called, let me see if I can get this right, the Hamidi Young Men's Industrial Association. And I think Hamidi, I mean, it's a town in the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. I don't think it was that. I think it's Hamidi as in the Hamitic myth, or the curse of Ham sort of idea. But he ended up becoming a really important part of the UNIA division that was already here, and he was responsible for expanding it into the thousands and thousands of members. Okay, so the police raid was heavily covered in the press, and of course, if you read the white press, it was a race riot, and these people were communists, and they were spreading red propaganda. And then if you read the Negro World or the black press, they were having a peaceful meeting of the UNIA, and the police obviously decided this is too big and too powerful of an organization that's growing, and they've got to be stopped. So the division in August of 1927 had grown from really maybe 80 people or so to about 7,000 people in Chattanooga over about a 2-year period. We can kind of follow from the division reports printed in the Negro World the growth and the activities of this division. We know that they had an active wing of the Universal African Legion, so that means that the male members were basically in a paramilitary organization. And we know that they had ordered uniforms, a lot of uniforms from the New York headquarters. So not only were they a paramilitary organization, but they were wearing military uniforms, and they looked the same. My guess is, just from piecing things together, and I could be totally wrong, but I'll just put this out there as a hypothesis. I think what happened was, the police caught wind from an arms dealer that this Emory Bailey was looking for weapons to buy. He wanted 200 rifles. They also learned that the Universal African Legions in Chattanooga were wearing uniforms, and they had applied to the city of Chattanooga for a permit so that they could hold parade and so that they could drill and march in uniform. And this was something that the city of Chattanooga denied them the permit to do, but also it really put this organization on their radar. And it wasn't too long after this that the police raid occurred. So after the raid, I could tell the whole story, but I don't know, I'm just piecing it together from different newspaper articles. But what it sounded like was they were holding a meeting at their Liberty Hall on 4th Avenue. The police came into the meeting, and they were stopped by two of the Legionnaires who were armed who said, "Do you have a warrant?" And the police didn't have a warrant because there was no crime being committed, and this began a kind of a back and forth shootout. And two UNIA Legion members, Garveyites, were shot. Neither of them died, but they were both seriously wounded. One police officer was shot through the leg. He didn't die either. But one of the policemen had turned the lights out, and so there was a lot of kind of chaos, and there were women and children in the meeting, so they were trying to get people out of there, so nobody would get hurt. And the police were pursuing people, trying to arrest people. They had brought out the entire police force to do this for backup. They confiscated all the weapons. They went around from house to house in the neighborhoods. Suspected members of the UNIA were, shaken down, and their weapons were confiscated. And so what ends up happening is, there's numerous arrests. There are the leaders, people like Emory Bailey and Milton Minyard are never come back to Chattanooga. And I found both of them in places in either Ohio or Michigan. And this was a really interesting thing that I found just by chance. And that was, there was a little small article in the newspaper, the Chattanooga newspaper, in December of that year. This is only a few months after the alleged race riot. And it was, the city government had decided to form what they called an interracial commission, and they wanted the leading black members of the community and the white leadership of the community to get together to address some of the grievances of the black community, things like housing, sanitation, healthcare, the very issues that the UNIA was trying to address. And so it was very clear that this event had precipitated this kind of effort to bring black and white leadership together. What the black leaders were told that was their mission coming out of this, the whites were supposed to improve social services and conditions in the city, but the black leaders, their mission was to develop better citizenship qualities in the black community. Now, when you think about that, what does that mean? What does better citizenship mean? Does that mean, oh no, you can't be loyal to a race-conscious organization, you have to be loyal to white America and the Jim Crow system? So that's really where I'll stop, and I'll tell you, I don't know that much other than just the research I've done in the last few days. My book really deals specifically with Georgia, Mississippi, and Arkansas, but it also gives an overview of Virginia, North Carolina, and other places. So I really appreciate you all coming out to listen to this, and I understand we're going to have a discussion, and so let's have it.